Welcome. I'm Bob Claflin.
And I'm Ron DePadua.
Ron, what do we have planned today?
Well, today, Bob, we're going to talk about steam cars. The earliest known steam-powered vehicles were invented in the late 18th century. They were large and bulky and resembled work wagons of the day. As their size became smaller, the tiller wheel form of steering, along with more comfortable seating, was added, making early steam cars more desirable. The simple boiler system generated power but took time to heat up and build pressure for the planned journey at hand. Water was readily available until horse troughs disappeared, but steam-powered vehicles were popular, and it wasn't until 1897 that steam cars became a household name with the introduction of the Stanley steamer. Now, F.E. Stanley built the first car in 1897. In 1898, after attending the first automobile show in Boston, Massachusetts, and unofficially winning both the speed and hill climb demonstrations, demand for their car grew. They improved on their car, gearing the engine directly to the rear axle, a major improvement. Stanley's won many a hill climb, being the first steam car to climb Mount Washington in 1899. Land speed records were set in 1906, breaking the 2 miles and 1 minute barrier at 127.659 miles per hour, remaining unbroken for 4 years. Many new models were developed, from the fast roadsters to the family man's touring car. Stanley steam cars were to be known for their speed and power.
And we're talking to this morning?
Coburn Benson from Concord, Massachusetts.
And Coburn, what are you driving today? God at it. Okay, Ron? Let's...
Now open the lid and put it at not quite 90 degrees. Okay, no, back this way. Yeah.
Mr. Baldwin from Worcester ran at the hill climb in 1909 very successfully. The car was not as successful when it was built in 1906, but apparently Mr. Baldwin got it running really good in 1909 and set a record of 54 seconds for the mile, a mile uphill and up 320 feet. We're still on the trail of the missing 7 seconds. But the question is, does anybody have the foggiest notion as to what happened to the original car? Much faster than the other Stanleys, and it's a lot of fun to drive on. Correct. We've looked at the original pictures very carefully, and to our surprise discovered it wasn't a glare of sunlight, but actually the hood was left unpainted and polished on the side panels.
Now this car, a lot of people aren't familiar with, is a Stanley. This is steam-driven?
Yes.
And how is it powered?
Apartment house. It'll burn either kerosene or approximately 50-50 diesel fuel and gasoline. And gas out of the can.
Yes, we're talking with this gentleman about a steam car, and he's going to give us a description on the different gauges and how it started.
Well, there are 3 gauges under the dash. The left hand is the fuel pressure, which usually runs between 100 and 140 pounds. The middle gauge is the pilot light that runs between 10 and 20 pounds, and on the Coleman fuel. The right hand is the steam gauge, which the car will move along at 200 pounds, move smartly at 400 pounds, and you usually carry 6 in case you've got to go a steep hill that gives you more reserve. The left-hand knob is the main fire. The right hand is the pilot, so if anything happens, you just handily shut them out from the seat. This lever, when you turn it around a turn, puts all the water that the water pumps are pumping directly into the boiler, regardless of any automatics. But you usually run with it open, and the automatics take care of it.
Okay.
The water level I keep on the high side in the glass, but it usually runs between just barely able to see it and the bottom nut. So I've got plenty of water to. I can see it going down and catch it. High water isn't usually a problem on this. And this is the glass that tells how much we have in the tank up front.
Okay.
To drive the car, it's very simple. It's simpler than many modern cars. It's just a throttle. If you open the throttle, the steam goes to the engine. And the lever in the center, forward is forward, and backward is back. And if I open the throttle a little more, I'll run over the cameraman, so we shan't do that. This valve lets steam through the engine directly to warm it up as you're getting going. But to move otherwise, it's you just close that and away you go. Very simple car to drive. But you really ought to also be a unfrustrated pyromaniac to reach down and turn a valve knowing that it can burn 10 gallons an hour, and if the fuel is not properly vaporized, it'll come out dripping wet and set the grass afire, the hot top afire, all sorts of things. Lift the hood so it doesn't burn the paint.
So tell me, you pretty much have to have a map of where all your water sources are when you're on a tour, am I correct?
Not a bad idea. Coming over this morning through Boylston, a fellow in his driveway waved to us, and I noticed the smile, and Malcolm said, "Aha, a water hose with a smile." So we wheeled into his driveway, and sure enough, he was a diesel truck mechanic that was a model rail enthusiast. So he knew what it was when I talked about steam, and said, "Be sure to use the hose on the way back if you'd like." So, yeah, when you see a green hose by the side of a house, do we remember?
Well, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy your car.
Oh, it's a lot of fun, and thanks for giving us a chance to show some of the younger people.
Here we are with Bill and Mary Sheridan.
Up that hill. This modern stuff can't keep up with it. That's what a Stanley can do.
Hi, I'm Ron DePadua.
And I'm Bob Claflin. We're at the Museum of Transportation today in Brookline, and we're viewing this car because it's quite different than most steam cars. Ron, what kind of car is this?
It's a 1905 Gardner Serpollet steam car. Very unique car.
It certainly is. So let's get some close-ups of this, Ron, and we'll explain what it's all about.
This has a 4-cylinder opposed engine. Transmission is not required. 2-wheel mechanical brakes, and the dimensions are basically 12 feet by 6 feet wide. Now on the engine, the bore is 3.15 inch with a stroke of 3.19 inch, rated at roughly 12 horsepower. Now looking at the front here, this looks like a radiator, but actually this is a condenser. And you can see the lid is open to the water tank and cover. The boiler is positioned in the rear of the car under the seat. Now if you come around here to the inside of the car, you can see the controls. And on the seat, which is tufted, now shoot over to, when you got enough, shoot over to the leather gloves. So what kind of car do we have here, Dave?
We have a 1907 Model H White, which is the smaller of the two models made in 1907. This is a 20 horsepower car, just as my Stanley is. The larger car was a 30, and a few years later they upped the larger car to a 40 horsepower, which is a real monster.
Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about the controls here, Dave?
Well, as far as the driving controls are concerned, they're rather similar to a Stanley's controls. A few differences in character. The throttle is a wheel on the White instead of a lever, but it's located with the steering wheel so that it's controlled by hand, just as the throttle on a Stanley is. Control levers for the engine, this is the reverse lever. This position is reverse, this position is forward. And as on the Stanley, it has provision for shortening the cutoff when you want to run more efficiently and don't need the full torque. This is the gear shift lever for the 2-speed rear axle. This is the low gear, and that's the high gear, if I remember correctly. How much you bet I've got that backwards. And this is the handbrake.
It's all right. I'm not going to be putting the sound in anyway.
Which is much like any other handbrake. On the floor we have...
Oh, I didn't see that one. Okay.
Which on this car is a flywheel brake. It brakes the drive shaft and not the rear axle. And then we have... This is the simpling valve that allows you to start a compound engine even as a compound engine, as opposed to the Stanley, which is 2-cylinder simple expansion. A compound engine uses the steam from one cylinder, the exhaust steam from one cylinder, as the supply steam for the second cylinder, which is made larger because it's running at a lower pressure. It uses the steam twice, whereas in a Stanley, which is a simple engine, each cylinder draws its own steam from the boiler. A compound engine in automotive practice is about 40% more efficient than a simple engine. But if you're in a position with a crankshaft that the high-pressure cylinder is not getting any steam, the engine won't self-start. So you have a valve that allows you to feed full-pressure steam to both cylinders, and that will allow you to start the engine. And then you let up the pedal and it runs as a compound once it's running.
Now, how long did these cars, how long were they actually made?
The White steamers were produced, the first White steamer, the experimental car, was produced in 1899, and they were in production from 1901 until 1910.
Why don't we take a look at what the engine compartment looks like?
Well, White had the engine in front, starting in 1903, and in the place that gasoline engines are normally kept. And here we have the high-pressure cylinder, the small one, and here we have the low-pressure cylinder, the high one. And here we have the valves which serve to simple the engine when you want to start it. They are operated by the foot pedal. This device is one above and one below the frame, so it's hard to see. Can't see it. Here is the main boiler control. It senses the steam pressure just like the valve on a Stanley does, but it controls the boiler in a different way entirely. When the pressure is too high, it shuts off the feed water pumps, which are located on this side of the engine down here. And when the water stops flowing to the boiler, another device, which we can't see because it's under the floorboards, called the flow motor, shuts off the fire. When the pressure drops, this turns on the feed water pumps again and starts pumping water to the boiler, at which point the flow motor senses the flow of water and turns on the fire. This car uses a flash boiler, so the control has to be very fast and goes on and off several times a minute in normal driving, whereas the Stanley fire, it's liable to come on once and stay on for an hour and then shut off. One above and one below the frame, so it's hard to see. Consumed less than 12 pounds of steam per horsepower hour, and that made it on a par with the best 3-cylinder marine engines of that day.
Excellent. Tell us a little bit about the lamps.
Well, these are...
And I think that is going to do it.
Projectors, and that's because they had 2 reflectors. The normal acetylene lamp had 1 reflector behind the burner, and they burn acetylene gas, which produces a very white flame. But this one also has a parabolic reflector that's in front of the burner, so as to get a larger percentage of the light onto the road.
How efficient is it, pretty much?
Until the introduction of electric headlamps, these were by far the best lamps on the road, and they are quite satisfactory for driving even in modern traffic, except for the minor detail that you can't dip them. You've got one rather wide beam that fills up the road with light, and oncoming drivers can blink at you all you want. There's nothing you can do about it.
For upholstery.
Shape of the rear of the body, and it seats 3 people in the rear. And this hump, which you see here, is actually the boiler. The steam generator is under the front seat, but it's large enough that it takes up some space in the back. I don't know too much about the body working done on this car, but it was normal in this day that all bodies were sheet aluminum on a wooden frame if they weren't thin wood on a wooden frame, and I believe this is an aluminum-bodied car. The leather upholstery is tufted in a normal manner because cars did not ride that well in these days, and you had to have very good seat cushions if you wanted a comfortable ride. This car is ironed for a top, irons on both seats, and I have not raised the top because it won't fit in this barn if the top is up. This is the pilot light, which you can light by pouring some gasoline in this cup by opening the appropriate valve and then sticking a match in there and then waiting for it to get hot enough to burn properly. And once the pilot light has been burning for about 10 minutes, then you can open up this valve, which feeds fuel to the main burner without the normal control system in place. This is called the firing up valve. And it allows you to turn on the main burner in the absence of other controls. Under normal operation, this valve, which is part of the flow motor, controls the main burner, and in here there is a piston which is moved by the flow of water on its way to the boiler, and that turns the burner on and off as necessary. Here we have the safety valve and the main throttle valve, which controls the flow of steam to the engine. Here's the main steam pipe going into the engine. Here are drip valves that allow you to blow the water out of the engine when it's cold. And this is the lever that controls the air pump. This is the air pump that's driven by the engine and can be used to pressurize the fuel tank. And there's also a fitting on the other side that allows you to connect a hose and refill a tire if you need to. At this time, cars did not carry spares. If you had a flat on the road, you took the tire off the rim and you dealt with it.
Oh, this is perfect.
Now the boiler is insulated with fiberglass under a sheet of old aluminum. This fairing I put on myself because the original material is now considered unpolitic. The original insulating material was asbestos.
Of course, we can't use asbestos anymore nowadays, right?
So now the insulation is glass fiber tape for the most part. The controls on this side consist of the water level automatic and the low water automatic. These are thermostatic valves that sense whether the water level is above or below the brass tube. Okay. If the water level is above the tube will be filled with water because the water level in the tube is the same as it is in the boiler. And under those conditions, the tube will cool off and the valve at the end of the tube will be open. If the water level drops and the tube fills with steam, that will heat the tube up and the brass tube will expand and close the valve. In the case of the water level control, closing this valve means that the water cannot bypass back to the water tank. It has to go to the boiler through the check valve. When the valve is open, the pressure on the system is low enough that the water just flows back to the tank through that valve.
Now, how long does it take to get up to steam before you can actually go out for a ride?
Well, that depends upon various circumstances. It depends upon whether your pilot's been burning for a while and is hot, or whether you're starting from dead cold. If you're starting from dead cold, you better figure on about an hour. But if your pilot's been burning for a while, 15 to 20 minutes will do it, but I usually allow half an hour. What I typically do is I light the pilot before I have breakfast, and when I finish breakfast, the main burner is hot enough to light without any fuss. And under those conditions, 20 minutes and I'll have steam up. On this side, we have a major boiler control, the pressure automatic. This has a diaphragm which senses the steam pressure in the boiler and controls the flow of kerosene to the main burner. So when the pressure is in excess of 600 pounds, it shuts off the burner. Thus, when the driver is working the car normally, the water level is automatically controlled and the steam pressure is automatically controlled. This is a water level gauge. It contains an aluminum float that follows the water level and a little shaft that goes up through those cooling fins to a magnet, which is on the other side of the dashboard. And that magnet attracts the compass needle, which therefore shows the water level without having to have any stuffing boxes carrying the full pressure of the boiler.
Okay.
This is the throttle. That controls the flow of steam to the engine and is the major control for driving the car. You open the throttle, the car moves, and that's about all there is to it. You close the throttle, the car comes to a stop. The spark plugs are a water level gauge of my own design. Any spark plug that's underwater is shorted out, and that will show up on an indicator on the dash. Now that gauge is a modified cylinder head temperature gauge from a two-engine World War II vintage aircraft. It's modified to read various temperatures around the Stanley. The needle on the left-hand scale measures the steam temperature at the engine, and with this car, it having a piston valve engine, it normally runs between 650 and 700 degrees. The speedometer, which is the correct version for the car, and it shows how many miles I've put on the car since I bought it, because I had to rebuild the speedometer and I set it that way. The next gauge to the left is the steam pressure gauge, showing the pressure of steam in the boiler. Well, we've lifted out the front seat so you can see some of what makes a steamer a plumber's nightmare. Here we have the air tank, which is used for, if necessary, filling up a tire, or in normal practice for filling up the fuel tanks with air to pressurize them. And here we have a lubricator for sending cylinder oil to the steam cylinders to lubricate them. This lubricator can be worked in an emergency by turning a hand crank, and I'll do that in a minute just so that you can see what the winker does when there's oil flowing through it. The bronze device on the other side that looks a little bit like the steam pressure regulator is the fuel pressure regulator. The fuel is pumped in considerable excess, and when the fuel reaches the set point of 150 pounds, that valve opens and bypasses the excess fuel back to the fuel tank. Well, I'm going to turn the oil pump handle by hand, and with any luck we should see the winker go. I'll give it one more shot. Now, ordinarily it does that 6 times each mile as you're going down the road. Here we have the throttle. Opening the throttle moves the car. It's the number one control for driving the car.
Today we're at the Yankee Candle Car Museum in South Deerfield, Massachusetts. And who do we have with me here today?
My name is John Shefflin, and I'm the resident historian here at Yankee Candle Car Museum.
Well, tell me, John, what kind of car do we have here with us?
Well, this is a 1903 Grout steamer, and it was made up in Orange, Massachusetts, which is not far from here. Actually, the company that, before they started making cars, was making sewing machines up in Orange. And this gentleman called William Grout had 3 sons, and they were not interested in the sewing machine business, so he set them up in the car business. And as early as 1898, they may have had a prototype steam car running, and then by 1900 went into production. Another unique feature of this car, which is common to some other cars of the era, is the tiller steering instead of a regular steering wheel. And of course, on this car, the tiller is on the right-hand side, and it took a while for us to get sorted out and figure out that we wanted to have the steering wheel on the left if we were going to drive on the right-hand side of the road most of the time. Of course, another interesting feature of this early steamer is that it has a wooden chassis frame to which the body is mounted, and most cars had a metal chassis. The steamer, however, has a wooden frame, but the suspension underneath is tied together by a metal rod that goes between the front axle and the rear axle, and it's in light of the way most suspension systems work, it's a little bit peculiar, but I guess for 1903 it worked okay. But steam cars were fast for their time. I would estimate this might be able to go 65 miles an hour, but it would be a terrifying 65, I think.
Yeah, I think I would want a seatbelt for this car, exactly.
Yeah.
It has a lot of nice fine brass, and I notice the boiler is front mounted. And I can see it's a very unique car of its time, and I want to thank you for showing it to us.
Well, you're quite welcome.
Due to the time involved in building up pressure and refueling, eventually steam power in America fell out of favor, giving way to the gasoline engine. But our fascination with the power and speed that steam had to offer will continue long into the next century. Perhaps one day we will look back at these wonderful cars and reconsider the use of steam.